So interview questions like this generally start very light. First, the interviewer will ask you what is a useEffect hook and what are its uses. And then as the interview progresses, he will ask you to make a custom implementation of the useEffect hook. So let's see how we can answer these questions. But before we do that, hit that subscribe button right now if you want to see more such videos like this, because you won't find content like this anywhere else on YouTube. So first of all, what is a useEffect hook? So useEffect by definition is a hook used in functional component in React to perform side effects after rendering, such as data fetching, subscriptions, or manual DOM manipulation. Let's see what I mean by that. Let's take an example of data fetching. So here I have initialized a new code sandbox. So I'm going to create a simple useEffect over here. So useEffect takes two things. One is a callback and second is a dependency array. And let's see if I write something inside of it. Let's say log fetching API, and let's save this. Now notice, when I reload this, see, we're getting this message fetching API over here. So when we have kept these dependency array as empty, this useEffect will run for the very first time and the only time during the life cycle of this component. In a scenario like this, I can use this useEffect for fetching the API. So okay, I'm gonna create 3 states over here for storing our data, loading and error, just like this. Let's import useState over here. useState gives us two things. One is the variable and other is the function for changing that variable. And it takes the initial state over here, which I'm gonna give this an empty array for our data, and loading it's gonna be true and error is gonna be null. Now inside of a useEffect hook, I'm gonna write the code for fetching our API. But before that, let me just create a function over here, const fetch data, and this is going to be an asynchronous function since we're gonna fetch our API inside of it. So also I'm just going to take a try catch block to handle our errors. So const response await and fetch, and I'll just take simple JSON placeholder API. So let's open another tab, JSON placeholder. And instead of this, let's just take this posts. Okay, I'm going to take this endpoint and I'm going to paste it over here. So it's going to fetch all of the posts for us and it's going to give us some data. Now over here, we obviously need to format that data. So first of all, I'm going to check if response.okay, if response is okay. I mean, response is not okay. We've kept not over here. So I'm going to say throw new error, response not okay. Else I'm going to say const fetched data equals await, and I'm going to format this data. So I'm going to say response.json, and now inside of it we have our final data. So we can just say set data to fetched data, and if there's any error, I'm going to just say set error to error. And finally, so inside of the finally block, this finally code runs every single time, even if the API fails or if it executes successfully. So in finally, I'm going to say set loading to false. Simple. Now we can simply take this fetch data and call it inside of our useEffect hook. So what this will do is it will only call this fetch data when the component renders for the first time. So all right, let's see. If we go to our network, we should have fetched it. Yeah, there we go. Posts, and in the response, yeah, there you go. We're getting all of our data. Cool. Now over here, let's go on and render all of our data. So simply, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a unordered list. Inside of it, I'm going to do a map for our data, data.map, return, and obviously I'm going to take post over here to render it, and I'll just say return li, let's say post.title. So if I reload this app, notice it fetches our API in the first render of our app. And that is what the major use case of a useEffect is. Whenever our component renders, we can perform some side effect. So this is one way of invoking useEffect. Now there are multiple different ways of invoking useEffect as well. Like we can put something inside of this dependency array. We can get rid of this dependency array as well. Or we can do some cleanup tasks. But before moving forward, are you ready to become a full stack developer in your own language? Meet GUVI, an IIT Madras backed HCL group company teaching tech in languages like Tamil, Telugu, Hindi, and more. Over 2 million folks have learned tech with GUVI, and here's the best part. No special qualifications needed, just bring your interest and passion. In 3 to 5 months, students and working professionals can learn the latest tech tools like Node.js, MongoDB, and others in your own language. Plus, get full support to find a job afterwards. Make apps like Instagram, Gmail, and Spotify to show off your skills. Learn from experts at Google, Microsoft, and more big companies. Start with a risk-free trial. Join a pre-bootcamp for a week after paying a small fee. If you like it, jump into the main bootcamp. If not, get your money back. No worries. Get live classes for 3 to 5 months with experts. Access recorded lessons forever. Ask questions anytime and practice heaps on GUVI's cool platforms. Get ready for jobs. Practice interviews, build a resume, and create your online profile. Find over 20 job chances based on how well you do, with salaries ranging from 3 LPA to an amazing 21 LPA. Kickstart your career with GUVI's full stack development course. Don't just dream, make it happen. Check out GUVI's website now and start your tech journey today. Link is in the description down below and pinned comments. So I'm gonna get rid of all of this code over here, and I'm gonna create a simple counter example. So obviously this counter doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to create a new folder, components. Inside of this, I'm going to create a new file called counter.js. And to save our time, I'm going to bring the code that I've written already. So let me just show you. Yep, this is the counter code. So what's happening over here? We have a state called count. We have another state called count1. Don't pay attention to it just yet. Let me just import useEffect first. Also, I mean use state and useEffect first. Yeah, so we have a state called count, and we have two functions over here, increment and decrement, which are changing that state whenever we click on these buttons. So when we click on increment, it's gonna increment the count. If we click on decrement, it's gonna decrement the count, and it's gonna render the count right over here. So okay, let's export this. Export default count. And inside of our app.js, let's import it. There we go. If you click on increment, it's gonna increment. If you click on decrement, it's gonna decrement. Cool. Now notice I've put this console log over here called re-render. First of all, I'm gonna get rid of this console log, but I'm not gonna show you just that just yet. So okay. So whenever we click on increment, this state changes, and React works in a way that whenever a state changes, it re-renders that component. So when we click on increment, you're gonna see component is re-rendering every single time this state is changing, whenever I'm increasing it or decreasing it. All right. So we have this useEffect over here, and we have kept the dependency array as empty. So now, obviously, as you already know, it's gonna run for the very first time, and then it won't run at all. So let me just refresh it. See, effect triggered for the very first time, and whenever I click on increment or decrement, it's not gonna get triggered anymore, right? So this is the first use case of useEffect. Now there can be another use case as well. For example, if I keep this count inside of it, now whenever I click on increment, it's gonna be triggered every single time this count changes and showing the real-time value of the counter as well. Okay, but what happens if I change this state over here? This is inside of this useEffect, but let me just bring this state and put set count 1 over here. So now whenever I click on increment or decrement, it's gonna change this variable and not this variable. So see, let me just clean it. Notice the useEffect is not getting triggered because this value over here is not changing, even though our component is re-rendering, as you can see, but this value over here is not changing, therefore useEffect is not getting triggered. Awesome. But what happens if I get rid of this altogether? So let me just get rid of this, and now, okay, now if I click on increment or decrement, see, every single time useEffect is getting triggered on every single re-render. Now doesn't matter what you re-render, it's gonna still get triggered. So right now I was changing set count 1, but what if I am changing just set count? So let me just remove this 1. Now if I click on increment or decrement, it's still gonna get triggered, because in this state, when the dependency array is not there, it's gonna get triggered every single time. Now what is a cleanup method in useEffect? So cleanup basically is done by using this return. So we need to do return, and we need to provide a callback over here. Now this return will only be invoked if the dependency array, that is this dependency array over here, let me put count over here, if this changes or the component gets unmounted. So if I just click on over here and say log, now let's clean this up, and if I click on increment, notice since this count changed, cleanup was invoked, but if I remove, it's not gonna get invoked anymore. And one more case is that when the component gets unmounted, so notice it's still gonna get triggered over here. So these are the use cases of useEffect and how useEffect works. Now let's go on and see the custom implementation of useEffect hook. But before that, if you're preparing for your front-end interview and you would like me to help you in your front-end interview preparation, just click the link in the description down below and book a one-on-one call with me. We're going to discuss tips, tricks, I'm going to give you a lot of resources, I'm going to design a proper roadmap tailored to your situation, which is going to help you out a lot in your front-end interview preparation. So click the link in the description down below and book a one-on-one call with me. So I'm going to open our files and I'm just going to create a new folder called hooks, because it's a good practice to create a separate folder for hooks as well as for our components as well. So I'm going to create a new file, useEffect or use custom effect.js. And creating custom hooks is not a rocket science, it's very easy. So it's just a simple function. So const, and a simple function just starts with keyword use. So I'll just say use custom effect, and this will take two things. As we already saw, our useEffect takes two things, one a callback function and other is a dependency array. So I'll just say effect, or you can call it callback, CB effect, whatever, I'm just calling it effect, and dependencies, or just I can say deps. Now let's see what are all the cases that we have to handle over here. First of all, we have to handle the first render case. Then we have to handle what happens if the dependencies changes. And the third case is the cleanup. Also dependency changes and no dependency array. Both of the cases. Right, so okay, let's handle our first render case first. So for this, I'm gonna take a useRef hook and I'll just say is first render. Now you might be thinking, why have I taken a useRef hook over here? So I'll just keep it true by default. So the reason why I've taken this useRef, because useRef, the value of useRef persists even through re-renders of the component. So let me show you. Let me just first import it. In this first render, I will simply say if is first render dot current, that is if this is true. So to access this value over here, we use dot current after the variable of useRef. I'm just gonna say is first render dot current equals false. This will become false now, and I'm gonna simply invoke our callback and return. We don't need to do anything else. We don't need to go forward and execute this hook anymore. We're just simply going to return, because that is all we needed to do in the first render. And now even if this custom use effect, even if our component renders and it still reinitializes this use custom effect hook, this value will persist throughout the re-renders. So that is the reason why we have taken useRef over here. If we would have taken use state over here, whenever our component would have re-rendered and this would have been reinitialized in our component, this value would have been lost and we would have initialized it back to true. So we won't be able to track if it's a first render or a second render. Now we need to check if our dependencies have changed or we have no dependency array at all. So for that as well, I'm going to take another useRef over here and I'm going to call it previous dependency. So prev deps. And by default, it's going to be empty because our dependency array is basically an array, right? So that is why for previous dependencies as well, I'm going to take an empty array over here. So cool. Let's think of a condition. So const deps changed equals. So how do we check if the dependencies have changed or not? First thing first, we need to check if we have a dependency array or not. So deps, so this deps over here. If deps exist, do something, else just say true. This true case will be useful for us when there is no dependency array and we need to render it every single time. So I'm gonna get back to that later. Right now, let's see this condition. If dependency array exists, then we need to compare it with our previous dependencies. So how do we compare this? JSON.stringify deps. I'm gonna stringify it and I'm gonna compare. If it's not equals to JSON.stringify previous deps, let me just close this, previous deps dot current, that is this one over here, right? So that is what we're doing over here. We're stringifying it and then comparing it. That is, the dependencies have changed. Then I'm gonna say if deps changed, so invoked our effect hook. Now notice, this will be invoked only in two cases. Either dependencies have changed or there is no dependency array provided to us. So as we already saw, that is what useEffect hook is all about, right? And in the end, I'm not writing this cleanup right now. I'm gonna write it after some time. Let me just do previous deps dot current equals whatever the current dependencies are. So I'm just gonna assign this deps, or if there is no dependencies at all, I'm just gonna keep it empty array as before. So cool, let's go on and try to use this. So let's export this, export default use custom effect. All right, let's go on over here and I'm gonna import it from our hooks. Let's save this and finger crossed, let's see if it works or not. All right, so let me just refresh this page and see. Let me just remove this cleanup, it's not gonna work right now. Now refreshing this again. Okay, so our dependency array was empty, so our effect was triggered for the very first time. Let's try to increment it. Okay, increment, decrement, our component is re-rendering, but our use effect is not getting called. So our first case is managed over here. Awesome. Let's manage our second case, that is when we enter count. It should change when the count changes. So, okay, if I increment, okay, this is working as well. If I enter some other state which is not changing, let's see if it gets triggered then or not. Okay, it's not getting triggered, that's good as well. If I get rid of this altogether, what's gonna happen? It should now get re-rendered every single time, even though the count is not here or count 1 is not here. So awesome, it's still working the same. Great. All right, now let's take care of our cleanup functionality for our useEffect polyfill. So when does our cleanup function runs? As already discussed, it runs either when the dependency array changes or when the component gets unmounted. So obviously we can't really simulate the functionality of component unmount because that is something that React does under the hood by using its fiber tree algorithm and a process called reconciliation, which manages the component lifecycle, including handling effects and cleanup during unmounting. But what we can implement is invoking the cleanup function when the dependency array changes. All right, so let's go back to our use custom effect over here. First of all, in our very first render, so if we are doing something like this, if we are returning during our cleanup, so obviously we will return this function from here. So inside of this, in our very first render, I'm gonna receive it. So const cleanup equals effect, and over here I'm gonna check. So inside of this return, actually, I'm gonna check if cleanup is there and cleanup is equals to a function, then simply invoke it for the very first time. And the second case is gonna be over here. So if our dependency changes, obviously I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna take it inside of this variable. Now I'm gonna test, let me just copy this condition as well. I'm gonna check over here if cleanup is there and cleanup is equals to a function and we have our dependencies, so deps, only in that case invoke it. So obviously see, if the dependencies doesn't exist, this will run every single time, right? But we don't want to invoke it if there is no dependency array. So we're only going to invoke it when our dependencies changes. Also, I made a mistake over here. This is going to be type of. So if the type of cleanup is function, and over here as well, type of cleanup is function, only then we're going to invoke it. All right, let's go back to our counter and try to test this. So if our dependency array changes now, so count, and if I click on increment, decrement, yep, you see our cleanup is getting rendered every single time. But what if this is empty? Clean on increment, decrement. Okay, this is not getting triggered. Awesome. So this is how you implement the cleanup functionality as well. If you like this video, you can access more such videos like this by clicking on this card above my head and accessing the complete React interview questions playlist.